Welcome to the City Club Forum. I'm Jim Lipscomb, president of the City Club. As you know, we attempt to bring enlightenment to our membership and larger audience on a broad variety of significant subjects. Few speakers we have had in recent years have addressed a more comprehensive and important subject than the guest we welcome today, Dr. Lester R. Brown, president of the WorldWatch Institute of Washington. And fewer still are so well qualified to speak on our subject, Transition, the worldwide effort to create a sustainable society. Born and brought up on a farm in southern New Jersey, Dr. Brown achieved distinction at age 16 when he won first prize for picking the most tomatoes in a statewide contest. He then earned degrees in agriculture, economics, and public administration from Rutgers, Maryland, and Harvard universities. And he has since been awarded 5 honorary degrees in recognition of his work as a leading authority on world food problems. Following 10 years with the United States Department of Agriculture, the last 3 as administrator of the International Agricultural Development Service, and 5 years with the Overseas Development Council in Washington, Dr. Brown in 1975 established the WorldWatch Institute, which in a short time has become one of the most widely respected international research institutes devoted to the analysis of a wide range of emerging global issues. In this connection, he has written 7 books, including his latest with the same title as his speech today, to be published this fall. Dr. Brown has been a guest scholar at the Aspen Institute, delivered the Nobel Symposium in Stockholm in 1974, and is a frequent speaker at universities and conferences in this country and overseas. The Washington Post recently described him as, and I quote, one of the world's most influential thinkers, end of quotes. Dr. Brown, we're looking forward to sharing your insights on some of the critical problems to be faced in our world during the balance of this century, and we're honored to have you with us today. Dr. Lester A. Brown.
Thank you, Jim. There was a period, and I wondered if I was ever going to get out of those tomato fields, but I finally did make it. A fellow Marylander, I live just outside the District of Columbia in Maryland, in the suburb of Chevy Chase. A fellow Marylander, Senator Mathias, was vacationing some time ago in Maine. He was not along the coast where most people vacation in Maine, but was in backcountry Maine, the part of the state where they look you over pretty carefully. And he'd been in the community for close to a week, and the local people were beginning to get a fix on him as to who he was. And one day he was at the service station getting some gasoline in his car, and the old guy who was manning the pump said, you work in Washington, don't you? And the senator said, well, yes, I do. He said, there's some pretty smart fellows down there, aren't there? And the senator said, why, yes. He said, there are. He said, there's some not so smart ones down there too, aren't there? And the senator said, yes. He said, I'd have to agree with that. He said, it's kind of hard to tell them apart sometimes, ain't it? Well, that's the problem with speakers from Washington. The title of the book, Jim, was, as it is in the flyer until yesterday, when the publisher changed it and simplified it to simply Building a Sustainable Society. So if you're looking ahead to publication, look for Building a Sustainable Society sometime in the fall. Just over a year ago, Science magazine carried an article by a team of researchers from the University of Chicago and the University of Florida that looked at a major center of Mayan civilization that once existed in the lowlands of Guatemala. This research team, after several years of work, using modern techniques of paleoecology and other devices available to archaeologists today, reconstructed the agronomic and demographic history of that civilization. They established that it began in 800 BC, about the time of Homeric Greece, and continued until the 9th century AD, when it suddenly collapsed. The population increased rather steadily over a 17th century period, reaching 5 million in the 9th century. 5 million is as many people as live in all of Guatemala today. It was a very agriculturally sophisticated civilization. And suddenly it collapsed and the population dropped to scarcely a tenth of what it had been within the span of a few generations. We don't know what the mechanism of collapse was, but we do think we know what the cause was. It appears to have been soil erosion, gradually accelerating, not necessarily noticeable within a particular generation, but taking its toll on the productivity of the land in that area. We have something in common with that Mayan civilization in that we too live in an unsustainable society. Unsustainable on 3 counts. Like the Mayans, we are now experiencing accelerating excessive soil erosion that is gradually undermining the productivity of at least a fifth, perhaps as much as a third of the global cropland base. It's not something that everyone's aware of. The best evidence that you get of it is the signals you get when you go by the supermarket checkout counter. That's the best evidence that there might be something wrong in the countryside. Secondly, the basic biological systems that support our economic system, forests, grasslands, fisheries, essentially natural systems in most of the world, are under excessive pressure. And thirdly, we live in a petroleum culture, and the oil supplies are beginning to diminish. So these are at least 3 important areas where we have to confront in the near future the unsustainability of society as we know it. Soil erosion is not a new problem. My geology professor at Rutgers used to say that soil is rocks on their way to the sea. And if you think about it a bit, that's exactly what soil is. Through the weatherization, rock is converted into smaller particles that become soil that supports plant life. Soil erosion is not new. The problem is the rate of soil erosion. According to a USDA study released in January of this year, soil erosion is now excessive on 34% of the U.S. cropland base. Excessive, that is, it exceeds the rate of new soil formation and is gradually reducing the inherent productivity of the soil. For the world as a whole, the figure is very close to that. We see soil erosion accelerate as we attempt to produce more and more land, as we move on to sloping land in many parts of the world, particularly in the Third World. It's a problem in the Soviet Union. We've had access to and have studied carefully the soil erosion, the reports from the soil erosion laboratory at the University of Moscow, and they paint a picture that's even grimmer than that in most countries and even in this country. We know that as world population moved from 3 billion in 1960 to 4 billion in 1976, and we're now going beyond, that the demand for many commodities of biological origin have become excessive, and the result has been deforestation, overgrazing, overfishing. Worldwide, the per capita harvest of wood peaked in 1967 and has been declining since then. Each year, there are 70 million more people in the world, and each year the forested resource base shrinks by about the size of Hungary. That's one reason why, if you're doing any work on your house and have to go to the lumber yard, if you haven't been following prices closely, you're in for a shock, because the price of lumber everywhere in the world is going up, and it's going up much faster than the overall inflation index. It's a lead factor. At some point, we have to come to grips with this. With grasslands, from at least early biblical times up until recently, the growth in the world livestock population closely paralleled the growth in human population. But now we don't have enough grasslands to support the continuing growth. So the human population continues to increase, the livestock population is leveling off, and per capita consumption of many livestock products is now declining. Beef, for example. Last year, beef consumption per person in this country was 21% below what it was in 1976. These are the U.S. Department of Agriculture figures. We see the pressures developing in fisheries. You go into a restaurant now and you look down the list of entrees at the seafood dishes and see the price has been crossed out and marked up. Always marked up, never marked down. The reason for that is that since 1970, the world fish catch has essentially leveled off, but the number of people in the world has continued to increase. So each year, we each have a little less seafood. And the way you allocate increasingly scarce resources is to raise prices. You don't have to raise them. They go up by themselves. But this is something you're going to have to get used to, because as we move toward the end of the century, the per capita seafood catch is going to be declining if population continues to grow as projected. So we see these pressures beginning to translate the pressures on the natural systems, croplands and forests and fisheries and grasslands, beginning to translate into economic stresses. In effect, worldwide, we are now beginning to consume the productive resource base itself. That's what overfishing is about. That's what deforestation is about. That's what overgrazing is. In the book, I paraphrase an idea that I think may have originated with an American Indian, which is we have not inherited the earth from our fathers. We are borrowing it from our children. And as you travel about the world and look at what's happening in the countryside particularly, you can begin to sense this. It's a very widespread phenomenon. It raises important questions of intergenerational equity that we have not given much thought. We've thought pretty much in terms of the present and assumed that the future will take care of itself. We may have to begin rethinking that. Soil erosion, excessive pressure on biological systems, and oil reserves beginning to be depleted. Oil production between 1950 and 1973 for the world as a whole increased more than fivefold. It was a remarkable period of growth. And now oil production for the world as a whole was actually lower in 1980 than in 1979. We are projecting, and we're not alone now, in projecting a slow, gradual decline in total oil production between now and the end of the century, which means that in per capita terms, with population continuing to increase, that the per capita decline is going to be substantial. In looking ahead at the converging demands on systems and resources, we think that food may be the bottom line. And in looking ahead at this decade, we think that the food problem may unfold before the end of this decade in much the way that the energy problem did in the 70s. At the beginning of the 70s, no one was really particularly concerned with oil, at least not very many people were. But then we saw that problem unfold. Between 1950 and 1973, a bushel of wheat and a barrel of oil were worth almost exactly the same, roughly $1.80 a bushel or a barrel. During that period, if you had a bushel of wheat to export, you could exchange it in the world market for a barrel of oil, 1 for 1. Today, it takes 7 bushels of wheat to pay for 1 barrel of oil. The terms of trade have shifted dramatically against the food exporters. Now, as the price of oil has gone up, it has left the price of grain far behind. But over time, the price of oil is pulling the price of food upward in its wake. There are 3 mechanisms for this. 1, oil is an input in agriculture, whether for fuel or in the form of energy-intensive chemical fertilizers or what have you. So oil as an input is contributing to higher food prices. Secondly, we're beginning to see governments around the world encourage the conversion of agricultural commodities into liquid fuels. Most of you are familiar with Brazil. This year, getting 20% of its automotive fuel from sugarcane, distilling it into alcohol. The Philippines now has an alco-gas program, started marketing commercially last September. Alco-gas in the Philippines is the same as gasohol in the United States. In this country, as we build more and more distilleries, we find that in addition to the traditional buyers in the North American grain market, that is the millers who buy grain for food purposes, the feedlots, and the exporters, we now have the distillers moving into the market to bid for corn in particular to convert into alcohol for fuel. As we build more and more distilleries, whether in Brazil or the Philippines or here or in a lot of other countries that are beginning to invest in fuel-grade distilleries, the floor price for food will become the energy equivalent of the food, because you'll always be able to convert the food into liquid fuel if the price drops, if the price of food drops too much. Thirdly, given the enormous shift in the terms of trade between wheat and oil over the last several years, any kind
Welcome to the City Club Forum. I'm Jim Lipscomb, president of the City Club. As you know, we attempt to...
For these countries now have a great deal of leverage in the world food market that the favorable exchange for oil gives them. And they will have the effect of bidding up food prices. I see almost every one of these countries importing more and more food now, year after year. It's easier to import the food than it is to try and solve the domestic agricultural problems. What do we do about these problems? Well, one of the things I think we're going to have to rethink is population policy. The existing projections show world population now just over 4 billion, going to something like 10 billion before leveling off a century or so from now. That is increasing 2.5 times. We don't think that we're going to see this sort of increase in world population. We think the stresses are going to become too great. We see inflation emerging as a major contraceptive force throughout the world. You can see it now in villages in Senegal and rural Mexico, in Bangladesh. Rising prices are squeezing living standards and leading people to rethink the question of family size in a way that they have not been doing for some time. We see governments, as in China, launching not two-child family programs as a social goal, but one-child families as the goal. Beginning a year ago last summer, the Chinese have been offering attractive economic incentives to couples who would agree not to have more than one child. If you're a couple in China today with one child and will sign a pledge not to have any more children, you will automatically become eligible for a 12.5% increase in salary, automatically eligible for much higher Social Security payments when you retire, and preferred access to schools all the way through universities for your one child. Those sort of incentives lead people to rethink how many children they want to have. The latest data I've seen from Beijing, we call it now, indicate that 36% of all the couples that have one child have signed these pledges. Interesting change, but beginning to face reality. I think we're going to have to begin thinking land use planning everywhere as the demand for food and for land increases. Our recent Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, Rupert Cutler, said that asphalt is the land's last crop. And I think in this country we're beginning to discover that. And at some point, the conversion of prime cropland to non-farm uses, whether it's shopping centers or highways or urban sprawl or strip mining or what have you, is an issue we're going to have to look at very carefully. We have treated agricultural land as a reservoir to use for whatever purposes that develop. I think that's rapidly going to become history. I think also that the days of the throwaway society are numbered. We live in a throwaway society. We throw away all sorts of things. A lot of things are designed for once-only use. The reason that the throwaway society's days are numbered is because when you throw away something, you throw away energy, and energy is becoming too costly to throw away. Those countries that perceive this most quickly and move to recycle paper and metals and glass, whatever, are going to have an economic advantage in the international competition in world markets. That is, they will have lower production costs than those that do not. One of the areas in which we've experienced this most dramatically is in automobiles. The Japanese have moved into first place, supplanting us for the first time since Henry Ford started the assembly line, as the leading world automobile producer. One of the reasons, there are many, but one of the reasons that they've been able to do this is they are importing scrap metal from the United States and converting it into automobiles and shipping them back. They can do it with much less energy than if they work with the original ore and derive the steel from that. There's a saying in Japan that this year's Toyota is last year's Buick. And it's true, except maybe we should say 2 of this year's Toyotas are one of last year's Buicks. But they've discovered that. The extent of recycling within the Japanese economy has gone from something like 6% of all raw materials in 1973 to like 48% today. They have begun to see very quickly the economic advantages of designing a system that will recycle economic materials. The other major challenge that we face as we move beyond the fossil fuel era is to develop renewable energy resources. In this country, over the last year or two, wood has replaced nuclear power in the national energy budget. We now get more energy from wood than we do from the 53 or 54 nuclear reactors that are in operation. Interestingly, it's been done with almost no government support, very little, whereas we've spent some $36 billion of public monies on nuclear power subsidies of one sort or another. A few weeks ago, there was in my office an economist from Poland, and I was showing him some of the statistics on various energy trends in the United States, including the sale of wood stoves, and was showing him how we've been selling 1.5 million new wood stoves each year now since 1973, I think it is. A very impressive growth curve. Not only wood stoves for residential use, but industrial boilers being used by industry in many parts of the country. And he looked at that trend of wood stove sales, and he literally put up his hands, and he said, no, he said, this is past. And I said, no, this is future. To the extent that we have large areas of woodland that are not now being harvested, and which can be harvested to a maximum sustainable yield, we need to take advantage of it. Not only we, but everyone in the world, I think, is going to be doing this. Waste materials, a potentially important source of energy, whether it's livestock waste being converted into methane, natural gas, or urban waste being used to generate electricity. There's some 242 or so cities around the world who now get a significant fraction of their electricity from burning the combustible garbage that's produced. Hydropower, large scale and small scale. We'll be issuing a WorldWatch paper in a few weeks on this subject. But we have worldwide, we have not realized more than a third of the potentially feasible recovery of energy from hydroelectric facilities, large scale and small scale. We believe that wind is going to be one of the sleepers in the global energy budget and in the U.S. energy budget as we move toward the end of the century. We think it's going to come on very fast. This year, there are 2 wind farms that are starting generation. A wind farm is simply an area of land that's planted to wind generators that convert the wind into electricity. One is being done by the Bonneville Power Authority in the Washington-Oregon border. The other is in New England. But we expect to see wind farms springing up all over the country where we have an abundance of wind power. Coastal areas, mountain areas, the Great Plains, etc. Next year, Hamilton Standard in Connecticut will begin the first assembly line production of large wind generators. So we see this coming very fast. Worldwide, the potential economically recoverable wind energy is estimated to be something like 7 times as great as hydropower. So it's an enormous resource. It's widely dispersed, unlike oil, which is concentrated in a few countries. I could talk about solar collectors, photovoltaic cells, solar architecture, various sources of energy that are going to become increasingly important. But in looking ahead, the interesting question is, what does the transition to a sustainable society translate into in terms of economic structures and what have you? One of the things we see is an enormous change in industrial patterns and in employment patterns. For example, as we move away from oil, as oil becomes scarce, one of the first things we see is enormous unemployment on the automobile assembly lines. Some 200,000 out of 600,000 in this country unemployed. May never be employed again in automobile assembly. The other side of that coin is that there are whole new fields of employment opening up. Energy auditors, for example. It's estimated we'll need something like 200,000 energy auditors to systematically do energy audits of all the buildings in the country, whether it's homes, office buildings, farm buildings, what have you, to figure out what sorts of investments are economic given present and projected costs of energy. A lot of work to be done there. Wind prospectors. Just as petroleum geologists in the oil age help determine where to drill the oil wells, so wind meteorologists will be determining where we should be putting the wind generators. Foresters. We're going to have to plant a lot of trees between now and the end of the century, particularly in third world countries. Family planning will become increasingly important, again, particularly in third world countries as a source of employment. In looking ahead, we see an important shift in investment patterns, both public and private, corporate and individual, from growth to sustainability as a goal. Let me cite 2 quick examples. Scott Paper Company has one of its large tissue manufacturing plants in the state of Maine. They are investing $65 million to convert that plant from being oil-fired, using 700,000 barrels of oil per year, to being wood-fired. They will use the wood, burn the wood, to produce electricity and to also produce process heat. The excess electricity will be sold to Maine Central Power, the local utility. The interesting thing about this investment of $65 million, which is no small investment, even for a company the size of Scott, is it will not increase the production of tissues by 1 box. The entire investment is for sustainability, not growth. You can see corporation after corporation making this type of investment around the country. You can see it at the individual homeowner level. Back in the 50s and 60s, home improvement loans were invariably for adding another room for a 3rd or 4th child, or a recreation room, a family room, whatever you want to call it. If you look at home improvement loans today, a great many of them are for insulation, for solar retrofitting, to improve the efficiency, to ensure that the people living in the homes can continue to live there as oil and other energy sources become more scarce. We see a redistribution of industry, lining up not so much with coal or with oil, but with the new energy sources, heavily forested areas, hydro sites in remote regions, geothermal fields in many parts of the world, but a change in activity. In looking ahead, we see agriculture becoming more important in the future as a source not only of food and of feed, but of fuel as well, in many forms. I was telling Jim on the way over, and looking at wind power, for example, we see the time when ranchers in Colorado, in central Colorado, will produce beef and electricity. They'll have wind generators scattered around the ranch and be feeding into the grid that supplies Denver with electricity, for example. That economically is already within range. But the 2 uses of land don't really interfere with each other. A wind generator doesn't affect the grazing capacity in any significant way. A lot of change coming. Agriculture becoming far more important. We don't see cities growing in the same way in the future that they have in the recent past. Perhaps aside from population growth itself, the most visible demographic trend since 1950 has been the enormous growth in cities, particularly in the third world. Enormous growth. But we don't see that continuing. You can have large cities with millions or even tens of millions of people, as in Calcutta or Mexico City or what have you, as long as you have a readily transportable form of relatively cheap fuel, like oil. You can't have cities of tens of millions fueled with firewood. Logistically, it does not work. So we're going to see a slowdown between now and the end of the century, we think, in the rate of urbanization, in some parts of the world, an actual reversal. A lot of employment will be created in the countryside as we turn to wood for fuel, to energy crops, to agriculture generally. In Brazil, for example, this pattern is already becoming very clear. As distilleries, converting sugarcane into automotive fuel, begin to displace oil refineries, we see employment moving into the countryside. You have to build distilleries close to the feedstock, particularly if it's sugarcane, which is large and heavy and wet. You can't transport it very far without using a great deal of energy for transportation alone. So you have to build the distillery within say, a 3-mile area of the feedstock, which means you have distilleries spread all over the countryside, and in effect, industrial employment being created in the countryside. Again, I could come up with a lot of examples. We are faced with an enormous transformation as we move from fossil fuels toward renewable energy sources, as we attempt to stabilize the soils on which civilization depends, as we attempt to manage more effectively and efficiently the basic biological systems on which we depend. But these changes will not come without changes in values. The economic and the social structure of a society at any point in time reflect the values held by the people in that society. And many of our current values, materialism, throwaway, overexploitation of natural systems and resources, are not consistent with our long-term survival and will thus, of necessity, be abandoned. You begin to see this now. You see it in things like automobiles, for example. Many Americans are shifting to small cars, not because they can't necessarily afford large cars, but because it seems to be the thing to do. There are even commercials now beginning to reflect this. I think Volkswagen has a commercial that for its sports car that where the last line is, it's getting to be embarrassing to be seen driving those large gas-guzzling sports cars, and playing on the change in values in order to sell their more fuel-efficient cars. Well, I could go on at length about values, but the interesting thing that we see and that we sense is, as we begin to create a sustainable society, it is generating a sense of excitement, because our generation, for the first time in many, many generations, has the opportunity to participate in the design, the shaping, the creation of a society, an economic system that can potentially last forever. Our immediate forebears who were involved in the early Industrial Revolution and creating a coal-based industrial society, or more recently a petroleum culture, did not have this sense of satisfaction, at least to the extent they were prepared to think about it. They knew that these were exhaustible fuel sources that would not last forever. But with renewable energy, whether it's wind power or hydropower or wood as a fuel, assuming we manage the forest right, these sources can last as far as we can see into the future. It's an exciting period, a very dynamic one that's going to require a lot of imagination, a lot of foresight. I would argue that today we're behind schedule in the transition to a sustainable society. And I would argue that the best indication that we have of this is global double-digit inflation in peacetime. That says that we're not doing some things right, or at least not quickly enough. And I'm hoping that we can begin to understand better the linkages between the natural systems and resources on which we depend and how we manage those, and the state of the economy, the rate of inflation and unemployment and growth and so forth. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Today at the City Club, we're listening to Dr. Lester R. Brown, president of the WorldWatch Institute. In just a moment, we'll turn to our question period, but first some announcements. Right now, we're in the process of winding up our annual membership campaign. Many of you have taken advantage of our special offer of joining for just $25. This special rate lasts only till the end of this month. So if you are not now a member and want to do what you've already been thinking about, now's a good time to sign up with us here at the City Club. You'll be pleased to know that since the 1st of April, when our campaign began, we have welcomed 247 new members. And we have another week to go. So why not join today? You'll be glad you did, and so will we. Today, as always, we have with us students from area high schools who are participating in our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Public Schools and with the support of Sohio. Today, we have students with us from the following high schools: James Ford Rhodes, John Adams, and St. Augustine Academy. Will you please stand to receive our welcome? Thank you. They will be meeting with Dr. Brown for their own seminar right after our forum here. Next week, our speaker will be novelist Robert Rimmer, who has a whole string of best-selling books to his credit, all having to do with alternate lifestyles and marriage patterns. His topic for us will be 21st Century Models for Sex, Marriage, and the Family. And this will initiate also a series of special seminars here at the City Club for our members on different facets of this subject. Make your reservations early for this important seminar. Now for our questions for Dr. Brown. We have two microphones, one in the front with Alan Davis, one in the back with Ken Kovach. Raise your hand to be recognized. First question, please.
Dr. Brown, how about the oceans as a source of renewable resources and the Law of the Sea Treaty? It has been negotiated over 7 years with 156 nations, yet our president fired the negotiators and may have scuttled the treaty. What's to happen?
I wish I knew. I've had occasion to have lunch with Elliot Richardson twice over the last month or so to talk about some of these issues. He's obviously distressed because the Law of the Sea Treaty represented years of work, and we were on the verge of potential agreement when the administration's changed, and there's some question now as to exactly how these issues are going to be sorted out. The one thing that we have made a lot of progress on is in deciding how to manage oceanic fisheries. And though at one time it was hoped that there would be an international oceanic regime with this responsibility, we, in a more pragmatic sense, have moved into a situation where individual countries are extending their offshore limits from 3 or 12 miles, the traditional limit, to 200 miles. And individual countries are assuming the responsibility for managing fisheries, and thus far are doing reasonably well. So it looks as though we at least have the potential of controlling overfishing in a way that we did not have a few years ago. The United States has adopted that approach. We've extended our offshore limits to 200 miles and are regulating the catch, establishing quotas both among our own fishermen and those from other countries who have traditionally been in the waters. As to how the mineral rights of the ocean will be sorted out over the long term, I think at this point is anyone's guess. We thought we had it worked out, but now it's up for grabs again.
Dr. Brown, you have given us an exposition on what lies ahead in social and economic changes. What about the political aspects? What transformation is going to take place either through evolution or revolution in our area? As we go from a free market economy to what appears to be a planned economy?
When we were inaugurating our 40th president in January, I was reflecting back a bit, and it occurred to me that I've been in Washington for 7 of our 40 presidents. I'm not really that old, but it's not that I've been there a long time, it's that they're turning over much faster than they did throughout much of our history. I think there's a good possibility that political leaders in countries throughout the world are going to appear increasingly incompetent in the face of the problems that now confront societies everywhere, unless they're exceptionally foresighted and imaginative and can understand the nature of the transition in which the world is being caught up. It looks to me as though the sources of instability in the years ahead are going to be as much economic as political, perhaps more so. Inflation is going to be a very divisive force in many societies. It becomes a way of trying to divide the economic pie, and various groups within societies get pitted against each other when inflation is not controlled. We see it in this country right now with the elderly, for example, with Washington and the administration proposing to squeeze Social Security at the expense of the overall budget. And interestingly, squeeze Social Security at a time when military expenditures are expanding rather impressively. And the question is, where does our real security lie? You know, can ever more sophisticated new weapon systems increase that security at this point? Or does it lie in other areas? It might be that new energy systems are far more important to our long-term security than new weapon systems. And yet, we're increasing the share of our scientists who are working on weapon systems at the expense of other needs. So I think political leaders who are not able, who have no vision of where we can go and where we ought to go, and the capacity to lead in those directions, are going to find themselves in trouble when re-election time comes. We saw this in France just a few days ago, for example, where the Gaullists, who've been in power throughout most of the post-war period, were overthrown by a very leftist, by European standards, government. I think we're going to see a lot of political turnover in the years ahead. Incidentally, one final point there. If our analysis at the Institute is correct, and if the food problem is going to become increasingly severe and food prices are going to keep moving upward, as we anticipate, then rising food prices themselves could become an important source of instability in many parts of the world. I doubt that there's any economic indicator that's more politically sensitive than food prices, and it looks as though we're on an escalator.
Dr. Brown, is your institute actively attempting to form a coalition between government, industry, farmers, researchers, educators, in order to hasten the process of change that is absolutely going to be necessary? I'm particularly concerned about this because we seem to be living in an era of deregulating everything.
I think there's some deregulation called for, but what we overlook is that as we put more and more pressure on resources, if we do not intervene to regulate their use, they may be destroyed. I mean, a classic case would have been oceanic fisheries. If governments had not moved to extend the offshore limits and assume the regulatory control of fisheries, they would eventually have disappeared. And we can see that happening in many places. Our own institute is not a political action institute. We are a research institute. With a very small one by Washington standards. There are a dozen of us all together, and that's total staff, including researchers as well as supporting staff. And we serve a global constituency. We're not concerned only with the United States, though obviously that's an important part of the world. What we're hoping is that what we're hoping to do is to raise the level of understanding of the issues and the relationship between the deforestation of tropical forests and the price of lumber, for example. Soil erosion everywhere affects the price of food everywhere. Trying to raise the level of understanding of these issues so that governments and interest groups, whether it be Friends of the Earth in Malaysia or the Audubon Society in the United States, can begin to respond to them and to form the coalitions that you refer to.
Would you be kind enough to elaborate on the role that you foresee in making the transition from petroleum to renewable energy resources for coal? It seems like a lot of futurists, when they talk about that issue, say that that's going to have a much larger role than you seem to be ascribing to it.
Right. I've covered a lot of territory in a short period of time. Have not said much about coal. We project coal to become increasingly important in the years immediately ahead, particularly as we substitute coal for oil and electrical generation. But over the longer term, we anticipate some problems for coal that are going to be difficult, the acid rain problem being one. Now a serious problem in the northeastern part of the United States, in southern Canada, close to the border, throughout northwestern Europe becoming a serious problem. Apparently a problem in large areas of China where coal is used not only for industrial purposes but in cities as a residential fuel. So we see the acid rain problem becoming sufficiently important that it will lead over time to a shift away from coal. There is also the troublesome question of coal contributing to increases in atmospheric CO2 and that in turn leading to climate changes. The National Academy of Sciences, using 4 different meteorological models, has analyzed this question, and they all indicate the same thing. That is, that increased coal use on the scale projected will lead to CO2 levels that will lead to climate change. The only question is how sensitive that relationship is and how quickly the climatic changes will begin to unfold. But I would suggest that with the first even strong suggestion that coal is beginning to alter climatic patterns and change rainfall levels in the Midwest, for example, and most likely lower them, the first indication of that is going to send up some alarm signals and lead us to rethink the long-term role of coal. The other thing to keep in mind from an investment point of view is that coal is an exhaustible resource, far more abundant than oil at this point, or gas, but it is exhaustible. And if we're going to make a switch from oil to another energy resource, rather than have 2 series of investments, oil to coal and coal to renewable, maybe we, in many cases, ought to go directly from oil to renewable and then have that done with.
Dr. Brown, I was interested in what you had to say about wind generators. And I can see the wind generator on the prairies of the West and the open spaces. Do you see what, for want of a better word, I would call the home windmill coming into effect in suburban areas and maybe even in urban areas where there are no buildings to block it and so forth? The
wind generators are being made on both a very large scale, the 300-foot, 3,000 kilowatt variety, and also the smaller size that's much more designed for individual ranch or farm or family use. One of the environmental problems with wind generation is that, particularly with the large generators, you get television interference. In effect, someone was pointing this out in a talk I gave to some business executives in Washington. He said it leads to pollution of the airwaves for television. I said my impression was that the pollution started a long time before the wind generators. It looks to us as though there will be a pattern of small-scale use where there is enough wind energy in mountainous areas such as New England, for example. But the big commercial uses will come in mountain passes in California, in Hawaii, which is now projecting a future, an electrical future dependent entirely on renewable sources, a combination of wind and geothermal and agricultural byproducts from the sugar industry and so forth. But I think it's going to be localized. I think in looking at England, for example, the very winds that have created so many problems in North Sea oil exploration and drilling may be the energy source that will replace the oil over the long term. And one could envisage rows of wind generators off the coast of Scotland, for example, a few miles offshore where they'd sort of be out of the way, hundreds, thousands of them that would be converting that energy, which is fairly strong and consistent, into electricity that would be feeding into the grid in the UK. So there are many areas in the world. The tropical trade winds throughout the middle latitudes, for example, are a potential source of electricity for many third world countries. So my guess is that a wind generator in every backyard, particularly in urban communities, is not going to be nearly as important as the larger generators in the areas where there's an abundance of wind and not so many people.
Dr. Brown, another natural resource which you haven't mentioned is fresh water. Could you enlighten us on the situation worldwide and in the country, and also how are we situated here in Cleveland, and how big an asset is Lake Erie?
When the U.S. government began the Global 2000 study that was released several months ago, one of the first things they did in the Council on Environmental Quality in the White House in dealing with the agencies was ask for sets of projections of various resources. And they asked the Department of Interior for their freshwater supply and demand projections for the world and for the United States. And had a hard time getting anything. There were several memos exchanged, and finally Interior sent 2 sets of projections of global freshwater supply and demand to the end of the century. One was by C.A. Doxiadis, a deceased Greek urbanologist. The other was by G.P. Kalainen, a Soviet hydrologist. And it dramatized an interesting problem, which was that in Washington we had no good long-term freshwater supply and demand projections and had to turn to others around the world for them. The problem with not having that information is that we have departments of government all planning to use the same water. The Department of Energy planning to use water in the West for synfuels, the Department of Agriculture expecting to use it for irrigation, and urban communities like Phoenix and Denver and Los Angeles expecting to have it for urban use. There's no doubt but that we're beginning to feel the squeeze in many parts of the world. The southwestern Soviet Union is being squeezed even more severely than the southwestern United States, for example. As we look at the southern Great Plains from central Nebraska south to the Texas Panhandle, we now know that the enormous growth in irrigation in that area that has underlain or supported the feedlot industry throughout the southern plains is based on water drawn from the Ogallala Aquifer, which is essentially a fossil aquifer. That is, it does not recharge very much at all. And the water table is going down. A study from the Department of Agriculture for 32 counties in the Texas Panhandle projects that by 1995, irrigation will have disappeared in those counties and they will have gone back to dryland farming, for example. So water is a resource that is going to act as a constraint on future economic activities, importantly food production.
Dr. Brown, the findings of the Club of Rome, as well as the study President Carter initiated for the year 2000, seem not to have aroused great enthusiasm for action. And now, with an administration that has appointed anti-environmentalists and conservationists, what would you suggest to raise the consciousness of the public?
It seems to me that one of the weaknesses in both at least the early Club of Rome work and the Global 2000 was that in laying out the trends, the linkages between those trends were not established strongly enough. And what I've tried to do in building a sustainable society, and indeed in a few instances here, is to point out that while global deforestation may appear to be a very abstract and remote sort of thing, it does affect the cost of housing, the price of the newspaper and of textbooks. I think we're going to have to begin to see how the global pressure on these various resources affects us individually, whether it's the price of food or the availability of housing or what have you. When we begin to understand that linkage, then maybe we can understand why we need a national population policy, for example, why we need to look more carefully at land use, why resource questions are important. They're not important because they're part of an abstract economic model. They're important because they affect the quality of life and living standards, not only for us, for people everywhere. And we have to realize that soil erosion in Ethiopia or Algeria affects the price of food in the United States over the long term. It's that realization that we have been slow in coming to, but which I think when it comes will provide a source for of action and response. And though in the early months in Washington the administration has been very casual in its response to these issues, my guess is that a year from now, when it's realized that inflation is still at the double-digit level or threatening to stay at the double-digit level, that there will be a taking of inventory and say, how come we've done everything right with fiscal and monetary policy, or at least we've tried, and we still don't have this under control. Then I think they'll begin to look beyond the economic indicators as such and look at the biological and resource and agronomic underpinnings of the economy, and to realize that some things have to be done and fairly quickly.
Dr. Brown, in our discussion of energy use and energy for the future, I detect a significant omission or sliding over the role of nuclear power as you see it developing now, and whether the proper role that it should play in the future.
I think you detected it correctly, though I did not say much about nuclear power. It's clear that nuclear power is in some difficulty. I think the difficulty that important decision makers in society have had in analyzing the nuclear power potential versus other energy sources is that it's very difficult to equate some of the characteristics of nuclear power, such as weapons proliferation or waste disposal, with some of the other energy sources. And it's been difficult to get a complete cost accounting, for example. We don't know how much it's going to cost to dispose of nuclear waste because there's no accepted technology for doing so. And until we do that and know how much it's going to cost to decommission a plant as well as to build it, then the economics will be very uncertain. The important determinant of the future of nuclear power in this country right now is not environmental groups, it's Wall Street. Wall Street will not touch nuclear power with a 10-foot pole. I mean, they literally will not finance. I don't think they'll finance another plant. Electrical World, which is the utility industry periodical, now projected in their end-of-year review for 1980, they do not expect any new reactors at all to be ordered in this country before 1985 or 1986 at the earliest. It's just very difficult to see how nuclear power is going to become the source of energy that we once thought it would be. The other thing to keep in mind is that with nuclear power, the lead times are very long, and higher interest rates begin to affect nuclear power in ways that they don't affect other power sources. When you're borrowing money at 16% and have a 10 or 12-year lead time before any payoff begins, then you can really get chewed up economically, and that's essentially what's happening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. Today at the City Club Forum, we have been listening to Dr. Lester R. Brown, President of the WorldWatch Institute, speak to us on the subject, Building a Sustainable Society. Dr. Brown, we're very grateful for you being with us today. Thank you all for being with us. The City Club Forum is adjourned.